Settlers have been conflicting with the Native Americans since before American independence. Sadly, the history of these conflicts shows a repeating pattern. The Europeans take some land, displace the native population, promise not to come any farther west, and then do it all again. In the colonial period, the Native Americans were pushed to the west side of the Appalachian Mountains. The British government promised that the colonists wouldn't cross beyond the mountains. So we declared independence and got a new government that didn't make that promise. In 1830, the United States passed the Indian Removal Act and relocated 50,000 Native Americans west of the Mississippi River between 1831 and 1838. This was the Trail of Tears, but everything was going to get better from here on out. I mean, there was tons of land east of the Mississippi River, and we'd never fill that. West of the Mississippi, the Native Americans would live without any further worry about being displaced or having the land taken from them.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
This agreement didn't even make it 20 years. The plains were described as being vast open lands with no inhabitants. It's often still described this way in history classes. It was described that way in this history class. Go back a couple episodes. The truth is, there were around 250,000 Native Americans living in the Great Plains at the time. The early travelers had few problems with the Native Americans, just travelers passing each other en route to their destinations. These settlers were heading for the west coast, not the plains. Conflict started again when the plains became the destination. The first plan that came during Western settlement was easy, just keep the settlers and the Native Americans away from each other. The first Fort Laramie Treaty set aside a large piece of land in the Black Hills that would belong to the Native Americans, creating the first reservation. And the government would guarantee that they would be unharassed by settlers. In exchange, the natives would have to keep the peace on their side and allow a rail line to run through the reservation, for which they would receive $50,000 a year as an annuity. As a quick aside, treaties by law are some of the most important legal documents that the United States government can make. In Article 6, Section 2, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, it states, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." To put it simply, treaties have the full weight of the Constitution supporting them. They are the highest law available according to the Constitution. So, be mad about what happens next. The deal didn't last long. The government did a poor job of enforcing its side of the treaty. Payments often never made it to the tribes, and settlers often harassed the tribes within the boundaries of the reservation. Some of the settlers would form militias and attack native settlements out of fear that what they'd heard about the native tribes was true, that they were savages, barbarians, and that they would attack them. A breaking point was reached in 1862. Payments stopped altogether, and even a civil war didn't stop settler aggression. The Dakota Sioux launched a campaign that became known as the Dakota War. They sacked settler towns and estates on the reservation property and captured or killed over 1,000 trespassers. While you would think the government would be short-handed with a civil war to win, sure enough, they found the resources to send a suppression army to quell this uprising. The army arrested 303 Native American warriors and sentenced them to death. Lincoln wound up pardoning all but 38 of them, and the 38 that he didn't pardon were all hanged in what was the largest mass execution in American history. Other tribes sought to fight back at this time, attempting to reclaim land from the settlers. This often ended with militias or federal troops or both raiding Native American settlements and camps that often led to many massacres. Including amongst them is the Sand Creek Massacre. Colonel John Chivington led a militia raid on a camp near Sand Creek, Colorado. The camp was flying two flags to show its intention. The first was the United States flag, the other was a white flag of surrender. There was no intention to resist at this camp. The leader of the camp had already negotiated a settlement. The number of dead Native Americans varies from one source to the next, but the one thing that remains consistent is that the majority of those killed were women and children, and not fighting braves. And sadly, this would not be the only such event. In 1867 and 1868, two new treaties were created to again try to make peace: the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek and the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. The Medicine Lodge Creek Treaty moved the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Coya, and Comanche to the Indian Territory. It's Oklahoma. The Second Fort Laramie Treaty promised the Black Hills and the lands of the Dakota Territory west of the Missouri River to the Sioux. This was less land than the previous treaty, but it was land with significant cultural value to the Sioux people. This treaty didn't last long either, because some cavalry officer by the name of Custer told the newspapers that there was gold in the Black Hills. Soon, white settlers began illegally mining and panning in the Black Hills, and the government offered the Sioux $6 million for the land. The Sioux declined. This land was important to them for cultural reasons. The government then seized the land and removed the Sioux. A few decades later, we carved some big faces in the side of one of the mountains, but I'm sure that location wasn't of any importance or anything. As an aside, back in 1980, it was decided that the federal government had acted illegally in taking the land from the Sioux and awarded over $100 million in damages. The Sioux have refused to take this money and have been focusing on reclaiming the land, much of which is still in government hands. The money is sitting in an account at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, just accruing interest, and as of 2011 was worth more than $1 billion. When asked why not just take the money, one spokesperson for the Sioux Nation simply said, "If the land was not for sale, how can there be a price?" And the only solace in this story for the Native Americans is that Custer didn't get to live long enough to brag about ruining the Black Hills. In 1876, Custer would lead his cavalry in a raid against what he thought was a minor encampment of Native American warriors under the chief Sitting Bull. Nope, it was Sitting Bull's full army. Custer and his men all died. That was probably the last hurrah for the Native American resistance, though. After Sitting Bull, most of the tribes either moved to reservations or tried to escape altogether. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce led his people on an exodus from Idaho towards Canada in hopes of peacefully settling outside of the United States. His warriors fought to buy the tribe time to make it across the border, but in the end federal troops caught up to his tribe. When Chief Joseph was captured, he reportedly said, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before, I have it in my heart. I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tahul Shute is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led on the young men is dead. It is cold and we have no blankets. The children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I can find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." After so many massacres and wars, the will of many tribes had been broken. They just sought to live peacefully. The government promised to return the Nez Perce to Idaho, but again refused to keep a promise and moved the tribe to Oklahoma. That broken spirit would be rekindled a few years later with the Ghost Dance. A prophet had seen that if the Native Americans came together, not hard because we kind of put most of them in one of a couple places, and conducted the Ghost Dance, that the white people would leave and the buffalo would return, and life could return to as it was. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the buffalo had been targeted for extinction just to hurt the Native Americans. This came to a head when a large gathering of Native Americans occurred near Wounded Creek in South Dakota. There is still a fair bit of contention about what happened at Wounded Knee, but here's what's generally agreed upon. Federal soldiers had been ordered to disarm the Native Americans in the camp. Soldiers formed a boundary around the camp, and others went in to collect the firearms. At this point, a rifle discharged and spooked the soldiers on the perimeter. The soldiers then blindly opened fire into the camp. I say blindly not to lessen their guilt, but because they also shot a lot of their fellow soldiers. By the time all the gunfire stopped, over 250 men, women, and children had been slain. Even the horses and dogs got killed. On the government side, 25 soldiers died from the shooting, and another 6 would die from the wounds received during the shooting. 20 medals of honor would be issued to the soldiers that participated in the massacre, and despite protests, those medals have still never been rescinded. Following that, the American government sought a new solution to this problem. Constant wars cost money that didn't need to be spent, and lives that didn't need to be lost. So a new idea came about and gained popularity. It was seen as more humane, but was really just a nightmare all its own. The Native Americans should be Americanized. A brief aside, what was done to the Native Americans has often been described as a genocide, and that is not an exaggeration. It meets the common definition easily enough. A series of campaigns by the United States government sought to destroy them by force. The second definition, though, it often feeds into the first. The destruction of a people's ability to support themselves as a culture. This can be done by limiting reproduction, limiting access to resources to live safely, destruction of a religion or culture. Just different ways to destroying a culture that binds them together as a people. And that's what the American government did next. The Dawes Act of 1887 allowed the government to break up reservations into private plots of land and grant them to individual landowners. The head of a household could get 160 acres of farmland or 320 acres of grazing land. This was like a Homestead Act for Native Americans. The land would be held in trust by the government for the first 25 years before the family would be given the deed. Similar action was taken in the Homestead Act for recently freed slaves. But it was no surprise that Native Americans were often given the worst land, and the government reclaimed millions of acres as surplus after they were done divvying up the land. To salt the wound, a ceremony was held when the land was being assigned to Native American families. The head of the household would arrive, dressed in his traditional clothing with a bow. He would fire an arrow into the sky, enter a tent, change into Western clothing, be given a plow and an American flag, and then leave. He was firing his last arrow as an Indian. This was called the last arrow ceremony, and it was meant that he'd be leaving that behind and now becoming an American. This served to break up tribal land holdings and make it easier to buy this land off of Native Americans later. But that was just the tip of the iceberg for the Americanizing of the Native Americans. The next step was to take their kids. Not even joking. Native American children would be taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where they'd be given new clothes, new haircuts, new language, and a new religion. The idea came about that we should kill the Indian to save the man. That the Native Americans should be taught how to live like civilized white men. To nail this point home, the practice didn't end as early as you would hope either. The top of the Wikipedia article says that the last of these schools closed in 1973, which isn't really that long ago. My mom was a teenager in 1973. But if you go further down on the list, if you go further down, you'll find a list of the different schools. And one in particular you'll find is the Wahpeton Indian School in North Dakota that closed in 1993. I was a kid in 1993. That was only 4 presidents ago. These schools were modeled on a number of things to take away culture from these kids. If you want the easy search result, just look up Carlisle schools or Indian boarding schools. The Native American was ignored in American propaganda except for when it was profitable, in Wild West shows or in scaring up money for the military during their next punitive campaign against the Native Americans. We moved west into land that was already occupied and then acted scared, like Native Americans were going to invade our homes after we had literally just invaded theirs.